In 1872 to 1876, George Smith's research on the Chaldean Account of Genesis in 1876 and the revised editions of the Chaldean Account of Genesis in 1880, notably those edited by A.H. Sayce. The name Abu-ramu is presented as the primary cuneiform evidence for the historical presence of the name Abram in Mesopotamia. Before the making of the Chaldean Account of Genesis, the library of Ashurbanipal was just a pile of 20,000 broken clay shards in the basement of the British Museum. Smith's unique engraver's eye allowed him to see patterns in the cuneiform that more educated scholars had missed. Explorers like Austin Henry Layard in 1817 to 1894 had already begun digging up the giant winged bulls and palaces in Nineveh in 1840 and in the 50s. However, they found the physical history, walls, statues, jewelry. The writing was still a mystery. While they knew these were the Assyrians mentioned in the Bible, like Sennacherib, they had no idea that an even older civilization, the Sumerians and Babylonians, had written down their own versions of the creation and the flood thousands of years earlier. George Smith wasn't a wealthy explorer. He was a former banknote engraver working as a repairer at the British Museum. Before his book, his job was literally to glue the broken pieces of the Library of Ashurbanipal back together. Smith was sorting through fragments when he read the words, "The ship rested on the mountains of Nizir." He famously became so excited that he began to rush about the room and started taking off his clothes in a state of scientific ecstasy. He had found a version of the Noah story that was significantly older than the Hebrew Bible. The announcement of George Smith's findings was one of the most famous events in Victorian intellectual history. It took place on the 3rd of December, 1872, at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology. Smith stood up a humble, nervous man who was not a trained public speaker and read his paper. He described a tablet that told the story of a man then called Sisit, who was warned by the gods of a coming flood. The key parallels he read aloud: the building of a great ship smeared with bitumen, the destruction of all life except those on the vessel, the ship resting on a mountain. The detail that Smith caused the most gasps was the description of the hero sending out a dove, a swallow, and a raven to see if the waters had receded, an almost identical match to the account of Noah. It was right after this lecture that the editor of the Daily Telegraph famously walked up and offered up 1,050 British pounds funds in 1872 for Smith to return to Nineveh to find the missing lines of the tablet. The public demand for more information about Abram, the Tower of Babel, and creation became so overwhelming that Smith spent the next 3 years translating everything he could find to produce the Chaldean Account of Genesis. The etymology, which Smith used to bolster the biblical connection, Abu, this is the common Semitic word for father. It is identical to the Hebrew Ab-ramu. This comes from the root Ramu, or Ram, meaning to be high, exalted, or lofty. In the Babylonian and Assyrian dialects of Akkadian, it appears as Abu-ramu, A, the sign for water, or the vowel A, Bu, Bu, a sign that can also represent a bird or a specific sound. Ra, Ra, a common phonetic sign, Mu, the sign for name or son, but here used phonetically. Smith noted that this was a theophoric name, a name that honors a deity, in this case the Father, God, without necessarily naming the specific god, like Sin or Anu. In Smith's chronological reconstructions, looked for the date when Abram left Ur of the Chaldees. Smith noted a specific tradition or calculation that placed a period of 317 years between two major historical biblical milestones. While Smith's primary focus was the Izdubar, Gilgamesh legends, he used the number 317 to bridge the gap between the birth of Arphaxad, the first patriarch born after the flood. By aligning these dates with the Babylonian dates for the reign of Hammurabi, whom Smith and his peers often identified as the biblical Amraphel, they attempted to create a scientific timeline for the patriarchal age. From the theory of Smith as Abram and the 318 men, a near match. It is also worth noting a famous biblical number that often comes up in the same chapters of Smith's book, 318. In Genesis 14, Abram leads a force of 318 trained men to rescue his nephew Lot from Chedorlaomer, an Elamite king. It was Smith was the first to find cuneiform evidence of an Elamite invasion of Babylonia dated by him to 2280 BCE, which he believed provided the historical background for Abram's military action. This was the most heated area of verification. Smith and Sayce believed they had found the name Chedorlaomer, Chedorlaomer on tablets. When Smith and later Theophile Pinches actually produced the Spartoli tablets containing names that sounded like Chedorlaomer, Kuamal, the critics had to pivot. They eventually conceded that the names were historical, but they argued the story of Abram defeating these kings was a legendary addition to a historical background. Smith identifies Ur of the Chaldees, the home of Terah, with the site of Muger in southern Babylonia. He knows that the biblical narrative describing Terah taking his family, including Abram, Sarai, and Lot, out of Ur, aligns with the historical movement of Semitic tribes during that period. Smith acknowledges the biblical detail that Haran, the son of Terah and father of Lot, died in the land of his nativity, Ur, before the family's migration. The 317 connection. While Smith discusses various chronological gaps, he notes that by the time of Abram's departure, the Chaldean culture was already ancient. He uses the genealogies of Terah's line to synchronize with the Babylonian king lists, particularly searching for the Amraphel, Hammurabi, mentioned in Genesis 14. Smith argues that Terah and his sons would have been immersed in the Chaldean literature he was translating. Smith points out that the names in Terah's family, like Sarai and Milcah, often have linguistic roots or parallels in Babylonian inscriptions. The death of Haran in Ur is cited as a reason why Lot, Haran's son, was under the care of his uncle Abram during the journey to Haran and eventually Canaan. The 317 to 318 discrepancy. While Smith noted the 317 years in his chronological calculations, linking the post-flood era to the birth of Abram, footnotes often debate the exactitude of these dates. They attempt to align the 318 men of Genesis 14 with the military strength of local chieftains recorded in the Chedorlaomer inscriptions. This provided the first external, non-biblical confirmation that the political exterior described in Abram's life, an Elamite king ruling over Mesopotamian city-states, was a historical reality. Smith's work includes commentary on the religious environment Terah and Haran lived in, the lunar cult of Ur. Footnotes emphasize that Ur of the Chaldees was the center of the cult of the moon god, Sin. Terah's name. Scholars, like Sayce, added notes suggesting that the name Terah might be linked to the Akkadian word for ibex, or moon, further rooting the family in the specific religious geography of Mesopotamia before their migration to the city of Haran, which was also a major center for the moon god. The death of Haran and the land of nativity. The text discusses the tragedy of Haran dying before his father Terah. The edits often explain that Haran's death in his native land, Ur, was a significant detail for ancient readers because it justified why his son, Lot, was legally adopted or brought under the protection of Abram. The migration provided geographic itinerary explaining that the route from Ur to the city of Haran followed the Euphrates River, a standard trade route of the 2nd millennium BCE. Smith and Sayce identified Abu-ramu as the direct cuneiform equivalent of Abram. The name is translated as the exalted father, from Abu, father, and Ramu, high, exalted, Assyrian versus Babylonian. Footnotes specify that while the name is common in Assyrian eponym canons, records of high officials, as late as 677 BCE, it first appears in much older Babylonian contract tablets. One of the most significant translations mentioned in the 1880 edition involves a legal document from the time of Abu-ramu, a king of the first dynasty of Babylon, dated by the editors to roughly 2300 BCE. The name Abu-ramu appears as a witness or a party to a contract. The presence of this name on ordinary legal tablets, rather than just royal inscriptions, suggested to Smith's readers that Abram was a typical name for a person of the Semitic population living in Chaldea during the patriarchal age. The connection to Sarai and Milcah. The translations of Abu-ramu are often presented alongside other family names to reinforce the Mesopotamian setting. Sarai, identified with the Akkadian Saats, meaning queen. Milcah, identified with the Akkadian Milkat, meaning princess. Conclusion. Smith used these linguistic parallels to argue that the family of Terah was deeply embedded in the culture and language of Ur before their migration. Smith was working on a synchronization table that tried to align the Chaldean kings with the biblical line of Terah and Abram. He was obsessed with the date 2280 BCE, which he believed was the key to everything. Smith was the first to translate the Isangil tablet, which gave the dimensions of the Great Ziggurat of Babylon. He argued that the Ziggurat of Borsippa bears Nimrud was the likely candidate for the Tower of Babel, described in later legends, as its ruins were famously charred and split, looking as if they had been struck by divine fire or lightning. Some later notes suggest it could be an East Semitic title or even linked to the god Anu, though Exalted Father remains the primary translation in Smith's context. The name was found on contract tablets dating to the reign of Apil-Sin, a king of the first dynasty of Babylon, roughly 2324-2300 BCE. This provided the land of nativity connection Smith sought for the biblical patriarch. The Assyrian eponym canon. A man named Abu-ramu served as a Sukulu Rabu, a high official or great attendant under King Esarhaddon in 677 BCE. Because Assyrian years were named after high officials, eponyms, his name was recorded as the marker for that specific year. Smith's footnotes often pair Abu-ramu, Abram, with Sarat, Sarai, Sarah, and Milkat, Milcah, showing a consistent pattern where biblical names mirrored actual titles or names found in cuneiform literature. The presence of the name in the time of Apil-Sin allowed Smith to place the times of the patriarchs within a specific archaeological window of the 3rd millennium BCE. When Smith found the name Abu-ramu on tablets from 2000 BCE, liberal critics argued this didn't prove Abraham existed. It only proved that later Jewish writers used ancient-sounding names to make their stories look old. They criticized Smith for being an amateur theologian who was too quick to find Abraham in every broken piece of clay. Critics attacked the timeline Smith proposed for Abram, 317-year gap. Critics noted that the Babylonian king lists and the Bible's internal timeline didn't perfectly align. This led to the famous effort to identify Amraphel, Genesis 14, with Hammurabi. While this remains a point of debate today, the criticism forced Smith's work to become much more scientific. Instead of just translating myths, the work evolved into a rigorous attempt to synchronize the entire history of the ancient Near East. To defend the faith, some Christian scholars flipped Smith's narrative. They argued that the Babylonian stories were corrupted versions of the original truth, while the Bible preserved a pure account. Some critics accused Smith of parallelomania, seeing connections where none existed to create a sensation. They worried that by making Abram a product of Chaldean culture, Smith was stripping away the unique divine inspiration of the patriarch. By the end of his life, George Smith had hoped to see the day when the Chaldean world would be as clear to us as our own. Through the refinement of his work and the modern digital tools we use today, that exterior view is finally complete. Upon his death, it was said that the man who had found the Chaldean Noah had now joined him. The British Museum eventually purchased his final notes and the fragments he had managed to collect during that fatal trip. He was buried in the Christian cemetery in Aleppo. His death sent shockwaves through the scientific world because he was the only person at the time who could read the fragments of the Library of Ashurbanipal with such speed and intuition. Because Smith's work showed that the Chaldean myths contained elements like a fall of man or a tree of life, some fringe religious voices labeled him a blasphemer. They felt that comparing the holy word of God to the idolatrous superstitions of Babylon was an insult to Christianity. While Smith died in Aleppo 1876 before he could fully answer his critics, his successor and editor, A.H. Sayce, along with other prominent scholars, refined the theory in response to significant pushback. As Smith's friend and the editor of the 1880 Revised Edition, A.H. Sayce was the most vocal supporter. He used the Abu-ramu contract tablets to argue that the cultural world of Genesis was authentic. He famously stated that the cuneiform evidence showed that Abram was a Babylonian name in use long before and after the date of the patriarch. Jules Oppert, 1825 to 1905. A pioneering French Assyriologist who was a frequent critic of Smith's rushed translations. Oppert challenged the idea that every name on a tablet was a biblical match. He warned that identifying Abu-ramu as the Abraham was a leap of faith rather than a scientific fact. Jules Oppert realized that before the Semitic Chaldeans, Abram's people, there was an even older civilization. He identified the Sumerians as the originators of the writing system. This allowed George Smith to understand that the Chaldean account of Genesis was actually a later version of a much older Sumerian original. One of the most intense points of criticism of the Chaldean account of Genesis involved the linguistic shift in Genesis 17:5, where Abram becomes Abraham. The critics argued that the cuneiform Abu-ramu only matched the first form of the name, Abram. They pointed out that the name Abraham has a different linguistic root that doesn't appear in the cuneiform tablets. When Smith's research suggested that the Hebrews had inherited these stories from a much older, more complex Mesopotamian culture, history suddenly grew by 2,000 years. When scholars realize that when Abram lived in Ur, he wasn't living in a primitive desert. He was living in a highly literate, ancient civilization that already had its own classics. Sayce and other Christian defenders countered by saying the tablets proved the first half of the story was historically grounded in Ur, and the name change was a divine event that wouldn't necessarily be recorded in Babylonian tax records. Scholars pointed out that while Abu-ramu is a perfect match for Abram, there is no clear cuneiform equivalent for the Ha in Abraham. Critics argued that the name Abraham was a later dialectal variation or a deliberate Hebraization of the original Babylonian name Abu-ramu. Smith argued that the change from Abram to Abraham in the Bible was a theological event, and therefore we shouldn't expect to find Abraham on a Babylonian tax receipt, only the original name Abram. Smith's death in 1876 at the age of 36 prevented him from seeing the full Babel on Bible controversy. But his identification of Abu-ramu remains one of the first times archaeology was used to put a face and a name to the biblical patriarchs. When the British Museum received his final crates of tablets after his death, they found that he had successfully located parts of the legend of Etana, a man who flies to heaven on an eagle, which Smith compared to the ascension myths of the patriarchs, the legend of Oannes, the fish god who taught the ancestors of Abram how to read and write. When A.H. Sayce took over the research but shifted the focus from finding tablets to linguistic analysis. This is why the later editions of the book, after 1876, are filled with the footnotes about Abu-ramu and the Amraphel debate they were trying to complete Smith's vision using logic, since they no longer had his miraculous ability to find the physical pieces in the dirt. In the revised editions, A.H. Sayce added footnotes to caution that while Abu-ramu proves the name Abram existed in ancient Chaldea, it does not necessarily prove that the specific individual mentioned on the contract tablet was the biblical patriarch himself. Instead, it serves as, on the ground, evidence of the cultural milieu from which the biblical narrative emerged. Smith's critics eventually forced the field to change its goal. Instead of trying to find Abraham in the dirt, scholars began to look for the Amorite migration, a broad movement of people that matched the biblical story of Terah and his family moving from the east. Sayce was much more critical than Smith regarding the transition from Abram to Abraham. He addressed a specific criticism that Abraham didn't look like a Babylonian name at all. Sayce argued that while the name was written in cuneiform, it wasn't necessarily a native Babylonian name. He suggested that Abram represented a West Semitic Amorite naming tradition, the Abu-ramu variation. Sayce pointed out that in many early tablets, the name appears as Abu-ramu. He noted that Abi, my father, is more personal than Abu, the father. In this view, the name isn't just the Father is exalted, but a personal prayer. My Divine Father is exalted. This shifted the view of Abram from a Babylonian citizen to a member of a specific Semitic tribe migrating through the region. Sayce explored the possibility that Abram functioned less as a birth name and more as a hereditary title or a throne name. Because both and Haran were centers of the moon god Sin, Sayce noted that high-ranking officials often took names starting with Ab, father. Sayce suggested that to the inhabitants of the name marked him as a father of the people, or a leader of a specific clan. Abu equals father, Am equals people. Abram is depicted as the moral superior in many encounters, such as with the king of Sodom. Sayce argued this was a reflection of the refined, highly structured legal morality he brought from the Ur-3 and Old Babylonian civilizations. Sayce proposed that when the family moved from the Chaldean, Akkadian, speaking south, to the Canaanite, Hebrew, speaking west, the name was linguistically translated. He suggested that Abraham was a localized, phonetic evolution of the name to mean father of a multitude, Ab-Haman in Hebrew, which allowed the name to keep its sound, but change its meaning for a new culture. Sayce pointed out that the biblical Abraham is never described as looking at the stars to predict fate, astrology, but looking at the stars to understand a promise, faith. Sayce used the exterior evidence of the Hammurabi era tablets. He argued that since names like Abu-ramu, Sarai, and Milcah appear together in the same historical layer of clay, they couldn't be late inventions. They were part of a name cluster, unique to the early 2nd millennium BCE. By adding these linguistic layers, Sayce moved the discussion away from, does this tablet mention the Bible, to, Does the Bible reflect the actual linguistic habits of the 2000 BCE era? His conclusion was a firm yes. The Smith says chronology he left behind. 2400 BCE, the rise of the first dynasty of Ur, the land of nativity. 2280 BCE, the Elamite conquest of Babylon. The event Smith believed triggered the migration of Terah and Abram. 2120 BCE, the birth of Abu-ramu, Abram, based on the 317 to 318 year calculation from the flood. 2100 BCE, the reign of Amraphel, whom Smith tentatively identified as a precursor to Hammurabi. Interestingly, George Smith also found a list of ancient epics created by the Babylonians themselves, which included the names of their reputed authors. Smith noted that while these authors, often priests or scribes, might be as mythical as the stories they wrote, their presence in the cuneiform records proved that the Babylonians viewed these stories as part of a formal literary tradition. Smith found that the names of the surrounding cities in the Haran region mirrored Abram's family tree. For example, he noted that ancient records mention places named Tilturachi, the Mount of Terah. This is located in the Balak River Valley of northern Syria, Mesopotamia, near the ancient city of Haran. Sarugi, Serug, Genesis 11:20, was linked to the city of Sarugi, modern-day Suruc. Sayce would also find out a fascinating pattern in the cuneiform records. Many of the ancestors of Abraham listed in Genesis 1:1, such as Peleg, Ro, and Serug, correspond to actual towns or districts in the Haran region. For Smith and Sayce, this proved that the biblical genealogy was not a fictional list of names, but a record of eponymous ancestors, leaders who founded cities or clans that were still recognized in the Mesopotamian administrative records they were deciphering. Smith's work effectively mapped the biblical family tree onto a specific geographic cluster near the city of the moon, God, Sin. It showed that the biblical writers were drawing on a genuine, ancient Mesopotamian tradition that accurately remembered the geography of the Aram Naharaim, the land between the rivers. Sayce later refined this by suggesting that the Abram mentioned in the tablets might have been part of an Amorite migration that used these cities as stepping stones on their journey from the Chaldean south to the Canaanite west. Critics like Julius Wellhausen, 1844 to 1918, did not deny that names like Sarugi, Serug, and Nahor existed in the Mesopotamian records. In fact, they used this as evidence for their own theory, the eponymous ancestor theory. Julius Wellhausen and his followers argued that Serug and Terah were not originally human beings. Instead, they were the names of districts or tribes. They pointed out that it was common in the ancient world to invent a founding father to explain a city's name. For example, if there was a city called Sarugi, later storytellers would invent a man named Serug to be its founder. To the critics, finding a city named Tilturaki didn't prove Terah existed. It proved that the writer of Genesis was using a geographical map to create a family tree. The critics actually forced Assyriology to become more rigorous because of their pushback. A.H. Sayce had to move away from saying, "I found Abram," and instead began saying, "I found the historical atmosphere that makes the story of Abram possible." This shift created the modern field of biblical archaeology. In modern archaeology and Assyriology, the discovery of Abu-ramu has shifted from being a search for a single person to a highly detailed study of Amorite onomastics, the study of names.
Modern research verifies that the name is part of a specific linguistic wave that swept across Mesopotamia during the Middle Bronze Age, approx. 1700 BCE. Modern scholars have also categorized Abu-ramu as a characteristically Amorite name, with thousands of Amorite tablets from the Mari archives and the Alalak texts that weren't available to George Smith prove that names built with the prefix Abi or Abu, father, and the root ram, exalted, were specifically popular among the West Semitic Amorite tribes. This aligns perfectly with the biblical tradition of Abraham as a wandering Aramean or Amorite migrant, providing a verified cultural match for the name's origin. Modern scholars have revisited the specific tablets Smith found. One of the most significant modern confirmations involves a tablet from the reign of Apil-Sin, the grandfather of Hammurabi. The name appears as Aba-Amrama. Linguists now see this as the archaic form of the name. It confirms that the name was in active use in Babylon precisely during the window of time, approx. 1900 BCE, that many archaeologists associate with the migration of the biblical patriarchs. It is now a proven historical name that matches the specific time period, 1700 BCE, known as the Middle Bronze Age. Teotoraki and Sarugi evidence the fact that the names of Abram's ancestors, Serug, Terah, Nahor, Peleg, appear as actual place names in the Balik Valley of northern Mesopotamia is a massive piece of the puzzle. This confirms that the writers of Genesis weren't just inventing a genealogy out of thin air. They were working from a real geographic memory of where their ancestors had lived. The topographical persistence factor relies on the specific legal details of Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah in Hebron as the physical anchor for the name of Abraham, with the purchase from Ephron the Hittite in Genesis 23. Scholars like Sayce pointed out that the contract for the Machpelah cave follows the exact legal formulas found in Neo-Hittite and Babylonian land deeds. The mention of all the trees that were in the field and the silver weighed out are technical legal phrases that prove the account was written by someone who understood the property laws of the 2nd millennium BCE. The cave itself remains largely unexplored due to religious sensitivities, but the exterior view provided by 19th century explorers and modern non-invasive scans confirms a double cave structure. Machpelah means double, consistent with middle. Bronze Age burial customs. The tomb at Hebron is one of the few places on earth with an unbroken chain of custody, the Herodian enclosure. The massive stone walls currently standing in Hebron were built by Herod the Great, but they were built around a site that had already been venerated for nearly 2,000 years. The mirror. Unlike many other biblical sites that were rediscovered later, the location of the burial site of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was never lost. This topographical persistence serves as the final proof that the man associated with the name Abu-ramu was a real person whose body was placed in a specific known piece of earth. The specific way Abraham buys the cave and the way his name functions in a covenant match realia, legal facts, that were only rediscovered in the last 150 years through cuneiform. This suggests the documentary witness is highly reliable. The writers possessed genuine ancient information. The Urfa excavations in southern Turkey have confirmed that the region of the Haran cluster, Tiltaraki, Sarugi, was a thriving hub of the Amorite migration in 1900 BCE. Smith found the genesis of the tablets, and his successors found the genesis of the man. They concluded that Abraham was the first modern man of history, a man who had a legal name, a geographic home, a political context, a written record, and a final resting place. Smith's duty was to find the missing pieces of the Izdubar, Gilgamesh, legends, In his final expedition, he was obsessed with finding the rest of the tablets to verify the Chaldean versions of the Tower of Babel, the creation and the fall, the life of the patriarchs. He felt that by finding these, he was handing the world back its lost memory. Beyond the dry academic debates, George Smith's discovery of his exterior view of the Bible triggered what we now call Assyriomania. In modern archaeology, 2025 to 2026, the verdict on Smith and Sayce has shifted. While the 19th century goal was to prove Abraham existed, modern scholarship focuses on historical plausibility. The current consensus is that the signature identified by Smith and Sayce accurately reflects the Middle Bronze Age, c. 1700 BCE, making the story of Abraham a remarkably precise record of that era, even if a single smoking gun artifact for the man himself remains elusive. The House of Abraham. It was British explorer Sir Leonard Woolley, 1880 to 1960, who famously pointed to one of these high-end houses and told the world, "This is the kind of house Abraham would have grown up in." He proved that the Ur of the Chaldees was a cosmopolitan metropolis, not a desert outpost. In 2021, the Abram outcome reached its modern peak when Pope Francis held an interreligious prayer service at the ziggurat of Ur. This was the first time in history a pope had visited the site of the Ur. There, Pope Francis stood just yards away from the House of Abraham that Sir Leonard Woolley, 1929, had excavated, officially acknowledging the archaeological site as the spiritual ground zero for the three Abrahamic faiths. In 1949, Woolley spent the last decade of his life in London doing exactly what George Smith never got to do. Woolley focused on finishing the massive, multi-volume technical reports of the Ur excavations. Then, in 1943, during World War II, he served as an advisor for the Monuments Men, the Allied unit dedicated to protecting art and historical monuments under Eisenhower. When Woolley died in 1960, the golden age of Mesopotamian archaeology, where one man could go out and find the world of Abraham, essentially ended. He had outlived almost all his contemporaries, including his wife Catherine and the 19th century critics, like Wellhausen. Wellhausen's literary analysis is still taught today. His claim that the patriarchs had no historical foundation was largely demolished by the civilization factors found in the mud of Ur and Haran. Wellhausen's greatest legacy was the JEDP theory. He argued that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was a mashup of 4 different documents. Jahwist used the name Yahweh. Elohist used the name Elohim. Deuteronomist focused on the law. Priestly focused on genealogies and rituals. When Smith found the name Abu-ramu and the H, Sayce used it to argue that the J and P strands weren't late inventions, but were actually based on authentic Mesopotamian linguistic traditions from 2000 BCE. Wellhausen finished his theory by arguing that the name changes and specific details in the story of Abram were simply literary layers added by different writers. Jahwist wrote the human stories of Abram wandering through the land. Elohist added the northern perspectives and dreams. Priestly source, Wellhausen's villain. He argued P was a late writer around 450 BCE who added the H to the name and the cave of Machpelah to create a legal basis for Jewish land claims. Wellhausen claimed the P source was late, but archaeologists found that the P descriptions of Abraham's contracts, the silver, the trees, the witnesses, followed a Middle Bronze Age, 2000 BCE, Babylonian and Hittite law perfectly. By 450 BCE, these laws had changed completely. A late writer would have written the contract using 5th century laws. The fact that it uses 20th century laws proves the source material was ancient. The ultimate finishing of this debate occurred when A.H. Sayce published his famous rebuttal, The Higher Criticism and the Verdict of the Monuments. The core arguments of the verdict. If Genesis 1:4, Chedorlaomer, fits the Elamite political climate of 1900 BCE, it cannot be a fiction from 450 BCE. The H added to Abram wasn't a priestly trick. It was a theophoric signature found in ancient West Semitic names. While JEDP might explain how the text was edited, it failed to explain where the facts came from. The verdict shifted to, the traditions are older than the documents. Sayce's final word. Archaeology has corrected the critic. The late writer turns out to be a faithful scribe of very ancient records. By the mid-20th century, the verdict was clear. The literary critics, Wellhausen, had analyzed the ink, but the archaeologists, Smith, Sayce, Woolley, had verified the world. Today, the verdict is that the Bible's account of Abraham is not a myth, but a high-fidelity memory of the Middle Bronze Age. As Sayce famously said, the archaeological spade has proven that the age of the patriarchs was an age of high civilization and widespread literacy. Good. My work has been successful, but it has cost me my life. I have done my duty, and I hope the British Museum will see that my family does not suffer. I have found many things that will throw light on the history of the world. George Smith.